All right, so welcome to the Brazilian Founders panel. I tried to use some machine learning to figure out what commonalities we have between us besides being Brazilian and being founders, and unfortunately I found none. You'll find that some of us started companies in Brazil, others started companies here in the US. Some of us have been living in the US for over 20 years, others have spent all of our careers in Brazil. Some have brought products from Brazil to here, others have brought products from here to Brazil. So I think it'll be interesting to hear some of the different stories, and then we can talk about some of the different experiences of each one of these folks. So if we could get started, if each of us could give maybe a few minute introduction to each of us. Tell the story of why you started the company that you started, but don't give the version of I saw this big opportunity and I decided to build a really big company. Tell more of a personal story as to why you wanted to become an entrepreneur. Out of all the things that you could do, where you were in your career and different macro events or personal events that led you to actually want to start a company. So maybe Bruno, we'll start with you at that end.
Oh, geez, okay. Thank you for the introduction, Fred. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you. Thank you, Marguerite, for organizing this event. I am on the younger side of this panel. I moved to the U.S. 20 years ago when I was 6, and so I was very worried when I thought this might be in Portuguese, as my Portuguese is very rusty. So I moved, I guess if you want the personal story, I moved to the U.S. when I was 6. The economic situation in Brazil was not great at the time. All of my family lives in Porto Alegre, and at least half of them live in Bagé, in various places on the border of Uruguay and Argentina, and various farms. But the rest are all judges and lawyers. But then when I moved to the U.S., my economic situation was also very different. It's very difficult to be an immigrant in the U.S. And so my mother cleaned houses, and so on and so forth. And so growing up in the U.S., I think, we came in here because it's a land of opportunity. So I always thought, I want to have the economic opportunities that not only my parents didn't have, but my cousins and my, aunts and uncles still don't have in Brazil to some degree. So I went to MIT, I majored in computer science. Not a lot of Brazilians at MIT, but a lot at the business school. And there, in the US, it's the land of entrepreneurship. It's about 2011, everyone was dropping out, coming to work in Silicon Valley. VC started to pop up. So there's a lot of encouragement to go into entrepreneurship. And I think, it is a wonderful thing that it's an ecosystem that really makes it out to catch you if you fall. But also there's plenty of inspiration of people that clear the path. And I think that especially that early stage ecosystem, the investors are just as much there to pay you as they are to give you inspiration. And so, given all of that, I actually ended up working at a startup called Kensho. So I spent 4 years in fintech on the floors of JP Morgan, which you're very familiar with, Michele. And they were a startup that I joined when they were 6. I was there until they were over 100. Then they exited for over $600 million in the fintech doing analytics for sell-side banks. And it was, I guess now that it's exited, I can say it was a very dysfunctional company, and I learned a lot. And I thought, man, if this company did so well, then I think I could start a company. So I was there for too long. Started a company with my 2 other co-founders, Ian Cinnamon and Samantha Gautam. Sims, my co-founder, also an immigrant from Nepal, and had a similar drive. And I assume a lot of you flew here, went through the airport. When you go through the airport, your bag goes through an x-ray machine. There's a person that stands there and stares at that x-ray. What my company does is we automate the analysis of x-ray screening with computer vision. And so looking for guns, knives, explosives at airports, but also courthouses, office buildings. We also work with mail rooms, cargo, they're looking for contraband. And so it's been an interesting journey. We work with the TSA very closely, the CBP, DHS. We also work in other countries. Japan is one of the biggest countries that we work with. I have tried working with Brazil. It's a bit challenging, which we can talk about a little bit later, especially when you talk about importing hardware and working with the government. Other countries are further up on the list to work with. So I've been doing that for about 2.5 years. We've grown to about 17, and we've been very fortunate to raise $6 million in venture capital from Founders Fund, ATC, and some other incredible investors. In parallel, luckily, Kensho had a nice exit. I've been an angel investor for the past year, and so I've invested in over 15 pre-seed early stage startups. And I also have a small venture capital fund that I started with some colleagues backed by First Round Capital, which is one of I think the best seed venture fund in the Valley right now. And so we invest 50K checks into pre-seed stage startups, and I've just learned a tremendous amount there. And one of the reasons I'm here at BayBrazil and here at this conference is learning about all the wonderful opportunities that I might be able to give back to the Brazilian ecosystem in terms of mentorship or investment or even just involvement. So yeah, that is the short story about me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a singer here. So I'm Eric Santos, CEO of Resultados Digitais, or RD for short. I definitely owe Anderson a dinner tonight, a good dinner. Thank you for all the flattering things that you mentioned. So, well, I don't live here in the US, I live in Florianópolis, beautiful island in south of Brazil, but I'm not from there either. I'm originally from São Paulo. I moved down there to study college in '98. So when I graduated, I started my first company. So I've been a tech entrepreneur for almost 20 years now. My first company was in the mobile space. We used to develop mobile apps and mobile sites for big brands in Brazil. But that was in 2003, 2004. Just to give you guys a little bit of perspective, if you don't remember, the iPhone came out in 2007. So it was definitely very different landscape. And in that process, we had to educate the market and evangelize the market. And then I ended up basically learning and having success with this thing that they call later inbound marketing, which is basically creating educational content around the topic of your business, and then trying to teach people about what's possible, the case studies and everything, and then you basically attract people, and then turns out that some of them are really good business opportunities. So around 2007 or 8, I realized that more than 80% of our projects were coming from leads generated through that educational effort. And then in this process of learning more, I also got to know a few companies that were getting started at that time. Tried to bring one of those companies to Brazil. That didn't work for some of the reasons that I think is still apply to this day. And then I thought that it was a great opportunity because it was a thing that I had as an entrepreneur, and by talking to other entrepreneurs, I realized that this opportunity was also common amongst the other SMBs in Brazil. So decided to sell my shares of the previous company to my former partners and start RD in 2011. And what we do, basically, we have now 2 products. We have our flagship product, which is a marketing automation platform called RD Station Marketing. And last year we acquired a CRM company, so now we have a sales product too. And on top of that, we have a lot of education efforts, a lot of content. We throw an event annually in Brazil. Last year we attracted 12,000 people to our conference. So just to give you guys a little bit of perspective in numbers, we have now 14,000 customers, 2,000 partners, about 700 employees, and just raised a new round of funding, or 4th round of funding. This one was $50 million round. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Michele Levy in Portuguese, Michelle Levy in English, which works really well. My introduction is that everybody tells me I don't look Brazilian or sound Brazilian, but I am born and raised in Brazil. So I always say that I'm half Brazilian, half French. My father was French, and half American, and really good in math. So that's my introduction. And as I said, I grew up in Brazil. I started working very young. I was 19 years old. I always like numbers. I haven't seen a spreadsheet I don't like. I still like them all, do not discriminate. So I got myself a job at Chase Manhattan Bank, which was downtown Brazil, Praça da Sé. for those who know. And my mom, who's in the audience, her old parental unit, will freak out every time I had to go to downtown Sao Paulo at the high age of 19 to go to work. I studied economics at the University of Sao Paulo at USP at night, so I could work during the day, so I was a full-fledged analyst all day. I made $100 US a month. Talk about child labor. But I enjoyed it immensely. At the time, it was enough to put gas in the car that my mother gave me. And it was a great life, but I told them I want to go to New York. We're a very international family, and I always dreamed of going abroad. I had never been. I've been in Disney World, but I said I can do that. So I flew myself to New York to chase to the head office. I scheduled myself an interview with the head of Latin America, and I got the job. So I moved myself to New York in '96 at the ripe age of 23. And I started working almost to death, being an associate in investment banking, for those who've been there, but it was a great learning opportunity. And I knew what I wanted to do was to work in building companies. That's the thing I always liked, and I got the opportunity to work in the private equity group. And to do that, you have to do your rotation in project finance, capital markets, IB, sales, trading, to be able to be a good investor with no operating experience. Now looking back, would not recommend, but it was great. I'll get to that in a second. I needed a break. I had been working at the time for 6 or 7 years, a very intense environment. So those who know me will completely understand this. My break was to go to Harvard Business School and take 2 years off, just to chill and figure out what I was going to do next. Went back to private equity. At this time was Chase Capital Partners. At the time, we are probably the strongest fund in Latin America, investing in, at the time it was called the internet. Our managing partner, our GP, was Susan Siegel, who became a phenomenon in the region. So I'm dating myself here. We did deals like Star Media. We IPO Star Media, Patagon. We exit to Banco Santander. And my pride and joy was Mercado Libre. I was invested in Mercado Libre. I'm the one that did the deal with them for eBay, which I'm sure at the time we thought were the lucky ones. Now we know for a fact eBay got really lucky with this investment. And then after 13 or 14 years of doing this, I really realized people were having more fun on the other side of the fence, which were all the entrepreneurs. You know, growing up in Brazil, which is one of the things we all discussed. Being an entrepreneur was not an option. It was not really a job. I think this generation has so much easy. If you really wanted to do that, you had to leave Brazil. You really had to look for opportunities. So now to embellish a story, I took 1 to 2 to 3 years working in public policy. You know, my family, judges, diplomats, it's something we discussed at the dinner table. So I spent 2-3 years doing that, really trying to figure out my next move, the inspiration for the apple to fall on your head, and you figure out what's your next startup gonna be. Word to the wise, that does not happen. So you have to have a couple of iterations before you get to your next one. At the time, Havaianas was being very successful in the US. They became a big thing with the flip-flops and everything, and I remember, at this time, I probably haven't lived in Brazil already for 15 years, this jelly brand that I grew up with. And I said, oh, this is interesting. I wonder what they're up to. And they were not up to much. So I went to Brazil, presented my plan to them. And I remember the first question Grindene, the owner of the company, asked me is, what do you know about fashion? I was like, What do you know about wholesale? I was like, you know, what do you know about retail? And I was like, I shop. You know? I'm very honest. So I was like, okay. It's like, literally, you're not dumb. You know, they had an office in the US for the past 11 years. Gonna make the brand happen in the US. So I was like, go lady. You know, I was pregnant at the time, this big. And he's like, nothing to lose. It's not working. If you can't make it work, we'll just go back to not working. And fast forward 10 years from that date, my daughter's 11. And the company grew. Very early, I realized we had to speak directly to the consumer. When I started the company, it was 2009. There was no Instagram nor anything in the picture. So I decided to open retail stores, which was the only way I could talk directly to the consumer. So we went on this crazy rollout. Me and my employee number 2, who knew a little less about retail or wholesale than I did, if that was at all possible. We opened 12 stores in 18 months in the US. In warm locations where it made sense for us to do that. And it was a big, big success. People started hearing about the brand, people started touching the product, buying the product. The stores actually made money, dying now. You know, retail made money. And we kept building. Today we are 112 people, I think, at the company. And the part that I was going to get to about the operator and the private equity and venture capital people is that I never raised money for my company. I don't know what that says about my past career, but I decided I was going to do it on my own. So I didn't want the Michelles in my new company. So that company was 100% funded by me, savings and everything. And then a year and a half ago, I got a call from a friend who said he had this great idea, and I do a lot of mentorship on the side, and I know a lot of the faces here from Endeavor that do mentorship as well. So I said, sure, I'll mentor you. And he came over, and it was the most beautiful business plan I've seen in my life, graphically speaking, and spoke directly to my heart. So happy to announce that last December I launched a new company with my founder. I'm the co-founder of the company called Costa, Brazil. It's the first designer clean luxury brand to come to market. So if you say you have on this side for beauty, you have Dior, Chanel, Tom Ford, all these fancy brands that are all chemical based or not clean or not pure. And on this end you have all the pure, natural, etc., which are not designed, they're homemade, they're less developed, less designed. So we create this white space, which is design and clean. So we launched last December. I worked on it for almost a year and a half. I almost died in the beginning because I was doing the two companies. Then I found the CEO for Melissa, who's been running the business, who's now there, managing the team and doing everything. I still show up, I think, 3 hours a week, marching orders just to check everything is going okay. And then I leave, and we launched Costa Brazil direct to consumer. We did a friends and family round, got great people, and it's funny, half of our investors are American, half of our investors are Brazilian, which is very funny. My founder is Francisco Costa. He was the former designer for Calvin Klein. He worked for Calvin for 13 years. Before that, he was at Gucci. He's a very well-known designer and creative mind and a fantastic human being. So we launched direct to consumer, then demand started ramping up. We don't have capital, we're going through fundraising as we speak. So we opened wholesale distribution, and we became, last week, the first brand to have the window at Bergdorf Goodman on Fifth Avenue, the 112 years of history of Bergdorf, with the first beauty brand to ever have that window, so super proud of that, thank you. Net-a-Porter, going internationally, we opened in Paris in 2 months, I got a Lafayette and Comme des Garçons. So it's really doing good, and the part that makes me more proud, and I'll end on that, is that all our ingredients are sourced from the Amazon, but we wanted to do this right. We partner with Conservation International, which is one of the largest nonprofit for reforestation and ocean protection in the world, and we work with them from the policy side. Francisco sits on the board, so all the way from policy to boots on the ground. So their staff, they have a staff of almost 200 in Brazil. They validate our sourcing. They help us find different communities for us to source from where we can do good. We got to make sure that everything we're sourcing is what it is, because in Brazil you have a lot of that. They say it is, but it's not. So they go and validate and open new markets for us to find new ingredients. So that's it.
Excellent. You can see why the machine learning algorithm had a hard time finding commonalities between these stories. I'll share mine very briefly. It's more similar to Michelle's than anybody else. I came to the US in '92 to do college. I went to medical school, then decided I want to transition over to the business side of things. I joined the venture capital fund in 2006, focusing on investments in medical devices and biotechnology, diagnostics. I spent 4 years there, and my reason for actually becoming an entrepreneur, I think it's because when you're early in your venture capital career, you spend most of your time doing due diligence, right? You're supposed to be the content expert. So you're meeting with companies every day, multiple companies a day. And it's fascinating because you really know more than anybody else does about a particular field, because you speak with every player in the field. Like when you work at a company, you have competitors. You have no idea what your competitors are doing. You try to find out what you can. I sign NDAs with all of them, and I know what all of them do. So it's fascinating because you can't share what you find, but you see all these patterns across them. And one thing that I realized is I was missing that. I was seeing a lot of no's all day long, and I would see all these super excited entrepreneurs sitting on the other side of the table, filled with energy, solving problems, construction hat on. I was asking the difficult questions. How will you solve this problem and that problem? And they didn't have the answer, but you knew that they were going to figure it out. And there was something about that was very appealing to me. I was waiting for the light bulb to strike in terms of an idea. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but it was 2011. The Brazilian market seemed to be taking off. When you're living in the US looking at Brazil, you see a big market with a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of things that don't work very well. I also, having been in the US for so long and having worked so closely with so many technologies, I developed a very good sense of what technologies work in Brazil, medical technologies, versus which ones don't. And a lot of that has to do with pricing and, pricing is really number one, but then you have to think about the regulatory process in Brazil, the way different healthcare plans in Brazil pay for things. So there's products that do really well internationally, but they won't do well in Brazil, and vice versa. So the opportunity was really to do a combination of bringing products from abroad, doing local manufacturing of products that make sense to have in Brazil, as well as consolidating the distribution channel. I grew the business to 350 people. We operate in two verticals. One is dedicated to selling equipment to physicians and physician practices, and the other one is selling equipment and reagents in clinical laboratories. I operated the company from 2011 to 2018. Then I moved to the board. I'm now executive chairman of the company, and then I started another company in San Diego in the biotech space, developing therapeutics for cancer. So, very diverse set. For me particularly, it's very interesting, having been like a year away from operating in Brazil, just realizing, man, was that hard. Operating in Brazil is one of the most difficult things you can possibly do. And I think I'm going to start with a question around that, specifically to Eric, since he's the one that's had most experience operating in Brazil, and then I have a different question for Bruno and Michele. But a lot of people here talked about what you did and how successful you were and all the things that you got right. I was curious, as you reflect on your experience and the things that actually worked, your near-death moments, since every entrepreneur has near-death moments, why do you think it worked in your particular case? What are the things that you think sort of worked out with what you were doing? A combination of you, the environment, opportunities that just allowed you to actually succeed. And I preface this by saying he wasn't prepared to answer this question, so if you want to think about it for a few seconds, that's okay.
I think the real secret is that I got a lot of no's from some investors, including Anderson, and I wanted to prove them wrong, so that's why I did that. But I think that it's definitely, well, I've never started a business here, but I can imagine that it's definitely harder there. I was having a conversation, you mentioned Endeavor, I was having a conversation with an Endeavor entrepreneur who just got selected. He runs a terrific SaaS company out of Atlanta. And we were sharing some ideas about, man, I don't even, some of the problems that you guys have, I don't even think about those things. The investors here don't think about those things. And then when I think about those problems, also taking back our story, I think that definitely we had some different challenges along the way, but at the same time, I truly believe that depending on how you overcome those challenges, those things can become source of competitive advantage, sustainable competitive advantage for the company. So in our case, for instance, we had a lot of challenges. Pricing was one. The lack of maturity in the market was another one. This kind of culture of service in Brazil, and so people need a little bit more of hand-holding, and also the kind of lack of sophistication in terms of technology for SMBs especially. So those are all very big challenges that we had, but again, we were able to solve those problems in creative ways, and now we have something that the American companies simply cannot copy because it's part of our core business model now. So I think that there are many things that you have to do as an entrepreneur to make it work, and still the jury is still out. Like, we don't consider that we're done yet. We're just in the beginning of the journey. But at the same time, I feel that looking at our situation in Brazil, and it's probably the same for other entrepreneurs in the room too, it can create a good advantage if you see these challenges as an opportunity to create differentiation.
Great, thank you. Michele, I was going to ask you the question. You've lived in the U.S. for a very long time. You went to Harvard Business School, worked at J.P. Morgan. You didn't have to work with anything related to Brazil. How did that factor into your decision? What got you to decide that you wanted to bring a product from there, or rather do anything else that you had available to you?
Great question. Two things. I think one, I don't know, although as I said, I've been here 20 years, half of my life here, half of my life in Brazil. My father was not from Brazil. Once you're born in Brazil, you're Brazilian, dude. There's nothing you can do. You know what I mean? It's just like you can hate it, you can bad talk it all day. There's no better place. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter where I lived. I lived in several places around the world. Brazil is home. I don't go as often as I would like to. So for me, having that connection is extremely important. And I know we all say that, and it's very cliche. It's about the people. You know what I mean? My best friends from college, from Universidade, are still in Brazil. It doesn't matter how many more people I know. I have new best friends, but the true friends are still there. I think that's one. Two, I looked at all the businesses in other parts of the world, and what I love about doing business in Brazil, and somebody mentioned that here before, as a Brazilian, when somebody says your product will be ready next week, I can sense and just smell the BS through the phone. I was like, there's no way how it's going to be ready next week. I will be down there at the factory to look at it. We had to do once business with China, and dude, I got shafted, you know what I mean? And I couldn't tell. I couldn't see it coming my way. And in Brazil, I can see the missile coming my way. When the yes is a no, when the no is a yes. It's just not easy, but I can read it. You know what I mean? In other parts of the world, it was just like you got shafted and you don't know where it came from.
And Bruno, I know you haven't had an opportunity to do too much in Brazil yet, but you did mention that you have attempted recently to actually do business in Brazil versus other places. Do you want to share a little bit of your experiences, being Brazilian, and in earnest, you have an opportunity to do business anywhere. Yeah. You decided to try to do something in Brazil. What was that experience like, not having done very much business there before?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that really resonates with what Michele said is it's the people make the biggest difference in Brazil, and I think the Brazilian friends, and it's like in Brazil, every stranger is a friend you haven't met yet, and I think Brazil really makes that true. And so when we were thinking about expanding internationally, our first batch of customers was international airports. So as you can imagine, there's only so many of them in the US, and so we started looking abroad, and I think there were a lot of Brazilian connections along the way that were very happy to open their Rolodex, really connect us with people. And on the Brazilian side, even very, very high up in the government, they're very energized about working with other Brazilians, working with, you're from the US, you're Brazilian, that's great. I was on a texting basis with the aviation secretary in Brazil on WhatsApp. He's like, I'm so excited here. Let me send you a picture of our team meeting about you guys. And so the energy is incredible. Sometimes the energy doesn't always lead to results, but I think that there's I loved every business trip I took. And so it definitely kept me wanting to come back. I think the difficulty is that it is a challenging climate in a lot of different ways. I think from the perspective of business, our company is very unique. We're not a SaaS business. We're not strictly software. And like Melissa can probably gripe about as well, we have hardware. We have we work with the government, we work with airports, and so in Brazil, most airports are owned and operated by the Brazilian government, by Faviero. And so anything you try to do becomes a government procurement process. You want to send samples to Brazil, the tariffs are way the heck up, and you can't just spin up a subsidiary in Brazil to absorb, kick off a lot of those things. And so as much as there was that energy, that enthusiasm, the climate meant that as a startup, we only have so much bandwidth, and we have to decide what is the opportunity cost. And so ultimately, we work with a few other countries. We work with Japan, we work with France, we work with Singapore, and what we found is a couple of things. Those international business channels tend to be more sophisticated, more mature. I think one thing I've been very surprised about in the startup world is Japan. They don't have a lot of homegrown startups and tech talent, and so they're used to importing everything. And so I've seen quite a few YC companies that are friends of mine, where their first cognitive standard cognition is doing Amazon Go as a service, and Japan is their biggest customer. Our biggest customer is Osaka Airport, and because they just move quickly. And so I think that in terms of Brazil, that energy is there, that excitement is there, and I think some of the trends toward privatizing, at least for us, the airports, are very good in that it opens up a lot of more channels to be able to work with the people, the customers on the ground, but it is not as approachable as other countries.
Great, and then one more question I'm going to ask you guys before I open it up, and this is about capital and capital efficiency. I thought it was funny when Peter from Google mentioned earlier that Larry Page told him, don't worry about cost, just worry about opportunity cost. No one ever told me that, ever, in my career. And particularly in Brazil, given the challenges in raising capital, that's even more of a problem. How do you guys at Entrepreneurs see this sort of challenge of, you don't want to be overly capital efficient, because then you're sometimes being penny smart, pound foolish. On the other hand, capital isn't so available, particularly in Brazil. How have your experiences as entrepreneurs, what advice would you have for other entrepreneurs that are sort of at the beginning of their entrepreneurship trajectory, where they're thinking about raising money versus bootstrapping? When is it the right time to bring money? When do you start to worry that you're just not exploring your opportunity appropriately, and so sometimes you have to think either I go big or I go home? What advice would you have? Maybe we start with Bruno, and then we'll come this way.
All right, I'll start at the earlier stage. So I think it was Anderson that said that people might talk to 50 investors before they get their first yes. That was certainly for us. We talked to probably, I think I made it was 70 investors to get 5 yeses for our seed round. And that doesn't get easier necessarily as you go to your Series A, as you go to your Series B. I've had friends that have had just as much difficulty as that very early stage. And so I think part of capital efficiency is twofold. I think one is, are you spending the money the right way? Because there's the big thing in Silicon Valley that VCs will always say, you should raise what you need, but you should need to raise, because if you're not looking to grow fast, if you're not looking to expand, if you're not looking to capture customers, then are you really a venture backable company? Or are you just a lifestyle business, which is not a derogatory thing as much as people talk about it as such sometimes in the Valley. And so I think there, with regards to Brazil, it becomes, what are your milestones and why are you being capital efficient? And so, if in your particular business, there's milestones you need to hit, then you need to calculate how long you need to make that money last. And if, saving money, or, I've had friends that have had to lay people off to hit their milestones. I think Notion is probably the most famous example recently. There were 2 founders moved to Japan and just worked in an Airbnb for a year, got rid of everyone and just coded all day. And so I think capital efficiency is about making the sacrifices you need to hit the goals you want to hit, and being mindful on the back end of, conversely, if you raise too much capital, are you then going to be able to hit the milestones needed to hit that Series A valuation, that Series B valuation? And so I think it's just finding the strategy that works for you long term.
How about you, Eric, in Brazil, and given all the capital constraints and so many no's from Anderson before you finally...
And well, a lot of people mentioned today that we have a very different situation now than 10 years ago. That is true. I think that in a sense we're lucky to be in the SaaS space, because we have a lot of benchmarks, so we kind of know if we're spending too much or too little. For instance, cost of acquisition and CAC payback, that kind of stuff. But one thing that's very, well, at least that's how I run the business, but I think it's true for most tech entrepreneurs in Brazil, that you cannot necessarily rely on the next round of funding. You have to assume that you might not have the funding. So it changes a lot how you manage the runway that you have. So in my case, like every new round of capital that I raised, I had a plan to achieve near break-even before starting the next fundraising process, because I knew, especially from my previous experience from the other company, that it was possible that even despite all the metrics and the growth that I had in my business, it was possible that I couldn't raise around. So I think it's different here, as by at least for the SaaS companies that I watch, they basically manage their burn rate, so they never get to a stage where they leave growth on the table. And then, but they know that the capital is there. It's just a matter of negotiating terms, evaluation if the company is performing well. So I think that's the situation that's different in Brazil in terms of capital efficiency. On the other hand, I think that it's really hard for most American companies to justify like some crazy movements like the ones that Fabrizio was talking about in the morning. So I think it's easier for us to think more out of the box in that sense and deploy capital in a creative way, not necessarily just to fuel the machine there. So I think we have that opportunity there, and definitely a lot more of greenfield to invest in a creative way.
And then what about you, Michele? You have the experience of actually bootstrapping most of your experiences, having been an investor before. So how did you think about that?
So I think I'm going to call it trauma. The trauma of spending so many years in private equity and venture capital and seeing everything that could go right and could go wrong. I was very, I want to say, reticent? Yeah, I was very concerned about raising money to do what I had to do. So I decided I would rather own 100%. I made that decision day one. I would rather own 100% of $1 million company than 10% of a $10 million company. I made that decision myself, on my own, and I put it in paper. That's what I wanted to do. And I did it. We grew way more than 1 million. I think today we do almost 2 million pairs of shoes a year. We have 1,000 points of sale. And we could be a much bigger company, I am sure. If we had outside capital, I could have more stores, our website could be more fancy dandy. There's a lot of things we could have done better, faster, but in 10 years, I think we were in a very good place, and I was happy with that decision when I made it. Fast forward 10 years, I'm a seasoned operator, which I wasn't then. I was an entrepreneur and hard, completely fearless. You just do it. I remember, again, back to my mom, I guess she's here. When I told her I was going to do it, she's like, Michele, so much money spent in education. Michele, you went to Harvard. You're going to sell shoes? That's the kind of encouragement I got. So, and many others after that. I can write a book about it. But, so now that I have all this experience under my belt and I feel the world's different. I can do things differently, I can do things in a different way. And the way we look for investors and the way we accept investors, and again, my business partner, Francisco, has been in this industry for 35 years, so it's not 2 kids starting a company. It's a seasoned, professional and a seasoned operator and investor. So the world's very different for us now. So I think we're, among the lucky few. And the way we're choosing who we're going to work with, and it's very funny, I said half of our investors are Brazilian and half are American. One great example is Valor Capital, who's one of our investors. Valor really is across, ocean, I guess, or across like US, Brazil. So it's great things because our product is sourced in Brazil, so there's a lot of things we need from Brazil. There's a lot of things we can do in Brazil. As you all know, beauty is a huge market in Brazil. So that will come for us at the right time. Europe and I think Asia will come for us, but Brazil is always there, and if we have more resources, we can grow faster and really own that space of luxury clean brand, which we are the first brand for. And I think you really have to count on good advice. Francisco and I are new to the beauty industry, so you really have to rely on people that bring expertise to the table. So we had closed our friends and family round, and then we met this amazing man who was the CEO of one of the largest beauty companies, and he wanted to invest in Costa, Brazil. And his expertise was so tremendous for us that we took a bridge that we had into the company to make room for him. So, friends, we have an angel investor in the audience. Edmo Chagas was actually my first investor when we first came out with the idea. Brainstorming with Edmund, he's like, how much you need? I was like, let me get back to you in 10 minutes. You know, so we got that. So it's like, it's choosing, for me now, people you want to work with, people that can really contribute, and it's no BS. It's real value-added investors that can teach you, because money for the sake of money, you know, at this age and time, for me, it's not what we want to do. We'll take it, make no mistake. You know, we have huge growth plans. You know, I guess in 4 months we have 50 points of sale. You know, we want to get to 1,000. Our website has very high traffic. We want to continue to grow that. Our direct-to-consumer sales all over the world. So, but I think it's choosing, really. It's like, even though you need it, you know what I mean? We need it at some point, but we had the fortitude that we could bridge the company until we found the right people, you know, to come on board. So I would just make that decision. What do you want this to be? Because a lot of entrepreneurs, and I don't think it's a sin, that's why I make a point of saying it. Lifestyle is not a bad word. You know what I mean? It's like very high double digits company. It's not a lifestyle, but for a lot of you, you know, with billions and billions, it is considered a lifestyle. But there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do too.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point there about lifestyle is it's almost like, it's not necessarily the high growth, but with venture-backed companies, it's also like go big or go bust.
Yep.
Like the VCs would rather you see you go out of business than, you know, become some profit dividends generating company. And so I think there's an interesting point about fundraising there in terms of trajectory. I think he touched on an interesting point about, I think Paul Graham calls it, are you default alive or are you default dead?
Yes.
You know, are you depending on the availability of capital for your strategies? Which definitely I've seen with direct consumer and consumer companies in general that have very unsustainable spend for customer acquisition and they don't diversify their channels. But I think the one interesting point that you reminded me of is that I think forced capital efficiency can actually be a really good thing when it comes to product market fit. Because I think that sometimes the availability of capital sends the wrong signal to the entrepreneur, and they can often correlate fundraising with somehow business success. Like, because I've been able to raise money, I'm onto something, but you know, your VC is not your customer. And I've seen more than one company fold because they were building a product for VCs and their KPIs were targeted at the VCs without focusing on the customer. And especially at the early stage, I'm sometimes the first check-in to a lot of companies that I work with. And sometimes, you know, I'll be there and I'll say, you know, why are you raising money right now? You don't even really know what you're raising money for. And I think there's a difference between someone saying, I'm raising money to explore the market, I'm raising money to test product market fit, and sometimes people say, I think I've got it, the money's there, I'm gonna run with it, and realize much too late that the signals you're getting from the venture capital community are inversely correlated with the signals they should be listening for from the market.
Yeah, you know, interesting, because where I come out, I don't disagree with you guys. Where I ended up coming out on this after my experiences, I think it takes as much effort to run, you know, a 1,000-person company as it does to run a local laundromat. In terms of the things that you have to worry about, the details. The difference is that a 1,000-person company has the scale. You have the managers. It's structured. I mean, business is amazing in a way that there's a scalable model there where, you know, whoever you are, whether you're running 1,000 people or you're managing 10 people, there's still a scalable structure there. As an entrepreneur, you just have to ask yourself how you want to spend your time, right? Because if it takes the same amount of time to build something small as it does to build something big, I feel like I'd rather be building something big. The other thing is some businesses force you to get to profitability very quickly, whereas others are a lot more patient about you becoming profitable. That search to become profitable quickly can be very hindering if there's a lot of different places you can go, because every additional person is a hit to EBITDA or is a hit to, you know, adjusted EBITDA. And if every time you want to experiment with something or you have a growth, you know, place that you'd like to test, if you can't do it, you miss out on a lot of opportunities because you have these pressures to actually be as capital efficient as possible. So again, from a personal choice perspective, I would rather be in a business where I will get rewarded for trying opportunities to actually grow faster, and where I'm not forced to go to profitability so quickly, and where the idea is really big, which means I'll be able to hire really good people and to have a lot more resources and thinking around the table to try to make the business as big as possible. Okay, with that, let's turn it to questions if we still have enough time. Do we? Maybe a couple more questions? Okay. So, Couple questions, anybody?
Mom?
I see a couple over there.
It's so cute that your mother is here.
I love
Michele.
it. Parental unit in the house.
First, thank you. Wolfgang Fengler from the World Bank. Great interventions, presentations. I wanted to ask you to which extent your businesses have been data-driven and to which extent your growth strategies are data-driven. And I guess it's yes, but just explain a little bit how.
Yeah, well, data-driven is one of our core values. We definitely live and die by the data. The thing that it's funny because we've always been like this, but now we have a lot of different startup initiatives inside the company. So we're trying to be a lot more entrepreneurial in the sense that, try, experiment, and find product market fit before really scaling that. And then that requires a lot more intuition, and a lot more, how can I say, more leap of faith in some cases. So we need to balance that because our company and our culture is really, it's very data driven, but we need to understand that it wasn't necessarily by being data driven that we got started. And now we need to make sure that all these startup initiatives that I mentioned have the right mindset and approach.
I guess on the consumer goods side, the customer is the boss, right? I can design the most beautiful shoe in the world, but if he or she doesn't like it, then there's no business, right? So I think technology for us has started very early. I joined this incubator in New York called XRC Labs. They're the largest one on retail and wholesale technology. So since we opened the stores, we probably have deployed 12 different technologies, from the little chips to see what shoe they touch, what they move, where did they take it, and then compare it to sales. But all very omni-integrated, although the word's old. Our stores with our website, and to the extent that we can, our wholesale customers. So for example, our stores have all this camera with neurosensitivity, that if you register one, we have this machine that you register yourself, you take your selfie, like everybody loves to take a selfie, we give you a discount, it's like little raffle, whatever, and you give us authorization to save your face. So say it's Michele, next time you come into the store, you will recognize me at the door, and you say to all our associates on their iPhones, Michele is in the house, and it will say what Michele bought last time. So it's no longer, can I help you? It's like, hey Michele, welcome back, how are you enjoying your flip-flops? And I think at Ilhabela, we were the beta for at least 8 of 9 startups that came from XRC to do this, and we integrated all the data. We're probably one of the very few fashion companies in the world that was fighting for talent and data scientists. People are like, what? So we use part-time because I couldn't afford it full-time, but we have a data scientist working. And again, AI is going to be huge for us because instead of me telling you what you're going to wear, we're going to use data to guess. You're going to tell us what you want to wear.
Yeah, I think the saying goes, you are what you measure. You need to have the data there, and oftentimes you don't know what data you're going to need when you're making that decision. So you need to collect as much data as possible and set up those feedback loops before you even know to use them. And that often means, it's paying for extra space, for extra services, but I think, you might not have that data scientist for a year. And I think something I've seen a lot of startups do as well is maybe you have all the right data, but you have to make sure that you're tracking the right KPI, that you're tracking the right metric. And I've seen companies in their investor updates, switch from, we went from total, money under management to, average deposit size this month, because they realize that sometimes, something that might be great might not correlate with, product market fit, or it might not correlate with being able to hit certain milestones. And so choosing the right metric is probably more important than, probably better off having no metric than the wrong metric.
Margarita, do we have time for one more? I'm a little worried about time.
Yeah, well, this was the very last one.
Okay, so very last question.
I'd just like to thank Michele for coming, because I'm live in Silicon Valley, and I actually create a product, and I'm sitting here all day going, I don't belong in the tech world. So thank you for actually having a consumer good. I actually do produce shoes. I have a shoe company as well, and I produce my shoes in Brazil. And I distribute them in the US, but we have direct-to-consumer around the world.
What brand?
It's very narcissistic. It's actually my name. I was talked into it because I'm actually a foot and ankle surgeon, and I have a patented insole construction, so women can actually wear heels all day. It's on the luxury side, and that's why I was talked into doing it. But it's Joan Olaf Shoes is the name of it. But I grew up in the retail shoe business. When I started my shoe company, I was very interested in going back to my roots, and I thought retailers were my friends. I hired a salesman, we wholesaled, and I found I was now in two businesses that nobody wanted to pay my bills. It was wholesaling shoes and being a physician. So I was ready to drop the wholesale market completely and go direct to consumer online, which I was on Good Morning America one morning. Roberts loved the shoes. I went to sleep, woke up the next day, and had all these sales. I said, "Man, this is a business I could sink my teeth into." So I was ready to drop that, and then one of the women who is a manager at Bloomingdale's heard the story and brought us in. So now I have this hybrid model, where it's good and bad. Bloomingdale's pays your bills. But I'm very intrigued by you opening up all of these stores on your own, because I'm also bootstrapping and pretty much self-funding. But that's a challenging thing to do. So what brought you to make that decision?
Can I make a quick suggestion? Would the two of you discuss this maybe at the break? Because I'm just a little worried. Otherwise, is that okay? Sorry to be rude, but we're already like 20 minutes late.
Yes.
Sorry about the rude interruption. Let me just thank you guys so much for all the sharings and the learnings, and congratulations to you all.